I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we cover the deadly Russian strike on an apartment block in Dnipro, in central Ukraine, that killed dozens of men, women and children. Plus, we look at the extraordinary news on Saturday that Britain will send Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 16th of January, day 327. And today I'm joined by Associate Editor Dominic Nichols and James Kilner, currently travelling across Poland, who reported on the vicious Russian attacks on civilian targets over the weekend. I started by asking Dom for a summary of the attack and the international reaction.
Well, hi, Francis, and hello, everybody. Yeah, so Dnipro, the city, the same name as the river that it runs alongside, or that it sits alongside. A city of about 1.4 million people hit on Saturday, part of a wave of attacks across the country. Hit on Saturday, dozens believed to have died. The regional governor, last update this morning, said that 40 people have been killed, 75 injured, 35 people still missing. But obviously that's from Saturday, so the hopes of pulling any more survivors from the rubble are fading fast. James will be able to tell us more about this. It was a 9-story apartment block that was hit. No military value whatsoever. I wouldn't even bother with the statement from Russia, but you can imagine that they didn't hit it. Not them, of course, etc., etc. I mean, it was a horrific attack. Terrible pictures on the papers today and across social media. It was part of a wave of attack on Saturday. There were possible ballistic missile strikes, something we haven't often seen. Regularly seen in this phase of the war since February the 24th, but possible ballistic missile strikes on Kyiv on Saturday morning, possibly fired from Belarus. No one's really sure because the missiles struck and the impacts were heard. No casualties, thankfully, but impacts heard before the air raid alarms went off in Kyiv, and that's not unsurprising. Ballistic missiles are going exceptionally fast, and they come in at a very, very high angle, so there's very little air defence can do. They get very little warning, especially if they're fired from Belarus. But also, there's very little air defence can do against them because they're coming in at such a high angle. However, like I say, there's a bit of confusion around that because there were impacts heard and no casualties before the air raid alarms went off. But there's no mistaking what happened in Dnipro, and James will be able to tell us more. But I mean, just it continues this pattern of aggression from Russia. I mean, it's not even. It's not a piece of civilian infrastructure. There's no energy plants nearby. Not that is in any way justification for what Russia's been doing. It continues this pulse. Remember, I had a brief from a Western official last week, and the official made the comment that with the dwindling ammunition stocks that Russia has for long-range weaponry, there's a sort of pulse of about 7 to 10 days between these big barrages that they've been able to go for, and that gap in between these barrages is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as their stocks dwindle. But as their stocks dwindle, they are increasingly turning to dumb munitions, so not precision guided, or munitions that are being used out of their primary role. So, for example, we know that they've been using in the ground-to-ground role some anti-ship missiles. So, as I've said before, the thing still has a warhead on it. It'll still explode when it hits something, when it gets to where it's the target it's going for, or anywhere else. But the guidance system and the way it operates, if it's designed for primarily a maritime attack, then it's not going to operate exactly as it should do in the land attack, and therefore the accuracy is even less. So I don't know what munition this was that was used in the Dnipro attack, but as Russia is increasingly depleted of its precision-guided munitions and general weaponry, it's turning to other forms of other forms of ammunition, some of which are just simply not suited for the task that they are using it for. And of course, layer on top of that, the moral consideration, or the utter lack of moral consideration, that they just don't care. They don't care that they hit civilian infrastructure. In fact, I think they're quite pleased when it does, because they believe that they can win by chipping away at the resolve of the Ukrainian society and the international resolve outside the country supporting Kyiv. But James will be able to tell us more.
Yes, and just before I come to James, who, as I say, is currently travelling across Poland as we speak, there's been some more details on this attack that's come out from President Zelensky last night, and I think it's just worth reflecting on when you hear these numbers and exactly who these people are as well. So, as you say, Dom, over 40 people have been killed and 75 injured thus far. Last night, President Zelensky was saying that 39 people were rescued, including 6 children. 25 were killed as of last night, including 1 child, with 73 wounded, including 13 children, with 43 missing. As I say, these numbers have now risen considerably from that. Among the dead, we know that there's a 15-year-old girl who was school president and a ballroom dancer. There's also a boxing coach from Ukraine's Boxing Federation. He's also been announced that he's been killed, survived by his wife and 2 children. So we are seeing detailed accounts coming through of who some of these people are, who, as I say, were just in this apartment block, and it was not a legitimate target. This is a war crime. There's no other way of describing it. So absolutely shocking what we're seeing and reading about this. Zelensky also announced last night that it would be adding a further 200 more Russians and Kremlin supporters to its sanctions list following the attack. He said, and I quote, "I think it is right that today there is a decision to expand our sanctions against Russian citizens and other persons who help terror." Now, something else that was going on over the weekend, which has really just brought all of this, I think, into an even starker focus for many people, is that it was Miss Universe, the competition, and indeed Miss Russia was present there wearing a dress that can only be described as incendiary for many. It was bright red, and it was seen, because the Russian state was involved in this, as being a deliberate remark on the attacks on Ukraine and possibly even the attack on the Dnipro itself. She herself said that the theme was the Russian Empire, not Russia, but the Russian Empire, and it was partly designed by the State Hermitage Museum. And I mention this not to be frivolous, but rather to say that so many people have commented on the contrast between the hideous accounts that we've been hearing today of people screaming in the rubble, trapped under the rubble of this apartment block, and people cheering at this competition for Miss Russia. And I think many, many people are asking serious questions to how it can be permitted for Russia to literally parade itself in this manner on an international competition like that, and to have been enabled to do so when such hideous attacks, many of which people are calling terrorist acts, are taking place so prominently. And indeed it shouldn't surprise us, given that we've seen numerous attacks like this now. But I think the timing of this is also relevant. But I'm just turning to James. James, you were covering this for us over the weekend. Just very interested to hear your reflections on the story and further insights that you no doubt have.
Yeah, I found myself reporting on this terrible story of, first of all, it was 5 dead and 15 injured, and then the death toll was updated to 12, and then it became 20, etc., and the personal stories came out, and the videos and the photos all made for an incredibly distressing shift, but obviously very important to report. And I think, in my estimation, that will go down. I think the death toll somewhere around about 39 at the moment. Children, women, men, everyone's been caught up in it. And I think it's going to go down, in my estimation, as perhaps the biggest or the deadliest single long-range missile attack from Russia since the war began. Now, I have to caveat that with long-range. I'm talking about missile attacks from boats or bombers, miles away. I'm not talking about artillery hits, which have taken out a lot of people. Unfortunately, like Dom said, the Russians denied it. They said it was a Ukrainian air defense system hit their missile above Dnipro and deflected it onto this missile block. Now, it's really important to stress straight away that the Ukrainians don't currently possess the right air defense systems to take out ballistic or cruise missiles, are waiting for the Patriot missile system from the US, which is some way off. And I'm sure Dom knows a lot more about it than me. But the Russian sort of answer, excuse, shifting blame, etc., has already been totally punctured. It's just not possible that the Ukrainian air defense system, especially around Dnipro, could have shot down this cruise missile.
Well, thanks, James. I'm sure we'll come back to this theme later today. Dom, before we do, however, and talk about, of course, the Challenger 2 tank story, which was the other big one over the weekend, what's the latest on other areas of the battlefront?
Yeah, so it's worth just checking in with Solidar and Bakhmut in the east, in the Donbass region, just because it's featured so highly in the news of recently. So this morning's Defence Intelligence update from British MOD said that intense fighting has continued in both Crimea, that's to the north of Bakhmut, and Bakhmut city itself. And on Saturday, so this is a British assessment, on Saturday, the Ukrainian armed forces, and their words, almost certainly maintain positions in Solidar, which is north of Bakhmut, as I say, in the face of continued Wagner Group assaults, unquote. So they're saying almost certainly maintain positions. So that's heavily caveated. But we think the last reporting was that although Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, Putin's chef, has claimed that they've taken Solidar, that's disputed. Even up to last week, it was not suggested from any sources that could possibly be independently verified that the whole of the town had been taken by Russia. There were still Ukrainian positions in the west of the town. That seems to be backed up by the British Defence Intelligence assessment, saying they've almost certainly maintained positions. So those positions are slim on the west of the town, and almost certainly is not a definite. But I just wanted to, because it's featured so highly last week, we just need to keep tabs on that. And of course, the suggestion is that Prigozhin's come out of the blocks quickly, claiming victory in Solidar as part of an internal power struggle in the Russian MOD. So he's claiming that Wagner are the only ground forces having any kind of effect at the moment. He has to have a victory to turn around for his influence operation inside Moscow, and therefore he was announcing last week victory. Still contested. We cannot verify that claim, but yeah, just bringing that. So it's still confusing, as we said last week, but I just wanted to bring you that because it's been featuring so highly in recent days.
Thanks, Dom. And James, I know you've been following Wagner very closely for us as well. Just wondered what your thoughts are on the news around Solidar and its general significance.
So I think this is a very significant moment both for Wagner and the Russian military defense. Again, as Dom just said, Wagner and the Russian military defense are absolutely at loggerheads and can't stand each other. And when Solidar was assumed to have been taken by Russian forces on Friday, the Russian military defense very quickly put out several statements lauding up the bravery of its paratroopers in storming the final Ukrainian redoubts, pushing away Ukrainian defenders, etc., etc. And they went on through the day, on Friday, detailing this, despite Prigozhin's increasingly shrill disputes about this. And he got increasingly agitated because, in his eyes, Wagner deserved all the credit. His fighters deserved all the credit. Until we got to this remarkable point quite late on Friday, where suddenly the Russian MOD turned around and said, actually, you know what, this was all down to the Wagner guys. The Wagner guys did it all. And it was such a remarkable about turn that someone must have put their foot down and said, what is going on here, guys? Stop the squabbling. And then later, it turned out that some incredibly well-informed Russian military bloggers or analysts, whatever you want to call them, a couple of them started quoting a meeting that Prigozhin and Putin had apparently had in St. Petersburg that afternoon. So Putin had been in a city called in the southern Urals all day. He'd been there to lay some flowers on the coffin of a notable local politician who just died. So he was outside the Kremlin, he's outside the sort of normal command scenarios, while all this row was going on over Telegram and the internet, etc. And when he did fly back, he had this meeting with Prigozhin. And apparently it's after this meeting where Prigozhin, who we know has reasonable connections with Putin, he's been done Putin's chef because his company, Concord catering company, has some contracts with the Kremlin. There's photos of him being a sommelier with George W. Bush when he was over, etc., etc. And he really acts as Putin's fixer in many ways. And the Wagner Group is an extension of of Putin, his sort of power, his sort of dirty mercenary power, and Prigozhin is like his sort of his sergeant major, if you like, running on his part. So Prigozhin turns up, he has a chinwag with Putin. He said, look, this is not on. The MOD are claiming, the Ministry of Defense, Russian Ministry of Defense are claiming this victory, but in fact it was the Wagner guys. Put a stop to it. And so clearly the MOD got a message from Putin or the president's administration itself. They're the only ones who could force this, abrupt about turn and said, look, you have to acknowledge Wagner's victory here. And they did. It was absolutely remarkable. And we all know that the Russian Ministry of Defense is full of lies and it massively spins things all over the place, over evaluating its successes and covering up its failures, etc. And here we were, it was exposed by its own allies, exposed by the Wagner group. So really the tension between these two fighting forces now is absolutely remarkable. Very quickly, more recently, maybe the weekend, the Russian military blogger community and the MOD and Wagner have moved on quickly over the squabbling of who captures Solidar, etc. But there is now increased noise, I'd say, from their supporters, Wagner sympathizers, saying that the victory in Solidar has come at a huge cost and it has exhausted the mercenary group, this bunch of adventurers, misfits and convicts. It's exhausted them and they're going to have to do another recruitment round, etc. And they're also starting to talk about subsuming Wagner in some sort of more official capacity under the command, in not really sure, under the command of or inside the Russian military. So at the moment, they've got a very clear command structure and they really have their own command systems worked out and they really look to Prigozhin for political leadership and some strategic leadership, etc. That might be subsumed more inside the Russian military, is what I've been reading. And in one sense, this does make sense, and in another sense, it doesn't at all. So you've got to try and meld these two very different forces, murderers and convicts, like I was saying, in Wagner and the sort of semi-professional force, the Russian army backed up by mobilized men who are real amateurs having go. So that is a difficult match. But the way it does make sense is that the Russian shock troops, their paratroop units, were completely decimated by the initial stages of the invasion in Ukraine in February and the really hard fighting for months afterwards. So the Russian army actually needs a shock force, a stormtrooper force, to be able to send over the top and take out Ukrainian positions. Now, these hardened criminals, which make up the bulk of the Wagner forces, these murderers they recruited from penal colonies or from Siberia, etc., they are the tough guys that can do this job. The mobilized men, the 320,000 mobilized men, half of which are in combat positions at the moment, they're not your shock troops. They might be okay defending trenches, that sort of thing, but they're not going to storm over the top and take out these tough, hardened Ukrainian positions. So there's something happening there. I'd expect another recruitment round from Wagner, plus maybe some give or take on their positions on where they stand, re the military.
Well, thank you, James, for that. Let's turn then to the big other story of the weekend, which is one that Dom and I spoke about at length last week, which was the possibility that Britain would send Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. We heard over the weekend that they would. That Number 10 gave an announcement saying that a certain number of tanks would be sent as a priority. Dom, what was the latest and what was your reaction to that?
Yeah, so as you say, this was not unexpected, although it's still big news. And I'll just preface all this bit by saying I was chatting to Western officials on Friday, some defence sources, no more details. But the person I was speaking to said that it would not be incorrect to categorise the week that we're now in, that we're now starting, as the week the West enabled Ukraine to win. Their words, saying that the announcement, they obviously knew about the thing that was going to happen on Saturday that we'll talk about in a moment, Challenger 2, but they said there's going to be announcements today, Monday, also Wednesday, and then running into Friday into the Ramstein contact group. So I think a number of things are happening. We were trying to work out last week whether or not the various different countries were jostling to be the first one out the blocks to supply tanks, or whether any perceived delay was because they were trying to come to a coherent position about who can announce what when, with industrial considerations, which are absolutely critical here, as we'll speak about. So trying to put together a coherent block, which may still be the case. We don't know what's going to happen this week, but let's do the what, the why, and the so what. So what happened, what it means, and why they did it, and so what does it lead on to? So the big news from the weekend was that after a phone call between Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and President Zelensky, Britain's going to send 14 Challenger 2 to Ukraine in the coming weeks, possibly 4 sent immediately. And also, we think 30 AS-90 artillery systems, AS-90 being a self-propelled 145mm artillery gun. Quite old. AS-90 was the artillery system of the 90s, to give you the clue, when it was brought into or designed and brought into service. But the fleet there is about 90 AS-90 left in British service, so about a third of that going to Ukraine. 14 Challenger 2 from, well, numbers vary, but we are supposed to have 227, of which 148 will be upgraded to Challenger 3. New gun, other bits and bobs, due 1.3 billion program due in the 2030s. Again, more of that in a minute. So we won't dig into the what's Challenger 2 look like? What might it do on the battlefield? There's enough articles we've written, and the last couple of days on the poddy we've talked at length about the ins and outs of what the tank can do. But what does it mean? I mean, as I say, this might be the first of many. So it was suggested that tanks were on that line, that sort of almost, in my view, self-imposed line about what's escalatory, what's too provocative in various people's ideas, as if the invasion's not been provocative. But anyway, would tanks be too provocative? And therefore, just one Western tank, I'm talking an American M1 Abrams. Forgive me the designation of the latest variants, but basically the Americans M1 Abrams, the German-made Leopard 2, and Britain's Challenger 2. French got Leclerc. There's other very, very capable systems out there, but these are the biggies. Who's going to go first? Who's going to gift it first? And there's all sorts of political considerations about end user agreements. For example, Poland expressed willingness to donate Leopard 2s to Ukraine, but had to get Germany's say-so, and still has to get Germany's say-so to send them. And it's thought that somebody was going to go first, and actually Challenger might be a slightly easier option, because in the bigger picture of NATO/Western capability, Challenger's a bit of an outlier. There's not many people use the systems, us, the Jordanians, a few others, but not in Europe. Uses a different nature of ammunition, has its own sort of logistic tail, its own system of maintenance, and so it is. I'm not saying it's only symbolic, because 14 Challenger 2 in your backyard can give you a serious headache, but in and of themselves, 14. And remember, of course, that we think Ukraine's expressed the kind of numbers of about 200 to 300 big main battle tanks, Western-made main battle tanks, and about 600 infantry fighting vehicles is what they believe they need to put together. I mean, that'd be, from that you're talking 2 or 3 armoured divisions, basically. But that's what Ukraine is talking about. So let's take the figure of 300 main battle tanks. 12 or 14 Challenger 2 is good, a move in the right direction, but it's not the end of the story. But it is arguably a moment for the West to step up and to get involved. And I suggested last week that the American decision on Friday a week ago, so 10 days, whatever that was, to send 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles was the kind of gateway in this debate. Because Bradley, although it's an infantry fighting vehicle, it's not a tank. It has a 25mm main cannon, but it has anti-tank missiles as well. It's digitally enabled. It is a very, very capable infantry fighting vehicle. It's a tank killer, but it's not a tank, for those doctrinally pure among us. But I think that was seen as, the US were, if they're not going to go as far as Abrams for now, then putting the Bradley in there was a definite signal of intent, and I think that has unlocked some of the political gearing in Europe. And then Britain came out with this. So what more we're going to see this week will be very interesting. I'm told that Britain's Defence Secretary is going to be briefing Parliament later on this afternoon in a couple of hours. So I'll be writing about that for tomorrow, and we will talk about it tomorrow. I expect he will only confirm that and put more detail about how those tanks are sent, when, where, and why. But he might give more details as well about other capabilities to be sent as well. But yeah, just keep an eye out for more announcements later on today, but also midweek and at Friday's Ramstein contact group. But there's also an interesting debate which we need to have, Francis, an interesting discussion, and we'll have more of this tomorrow. We're going to have former RAF Air Marshal Edward Stringer, who used to head up defence capability. He's going to talk about this idea that perhaps this is a moment for Britain. So the British Army, in terms of capital equipment, so stuff, is in a bad state of repair at the moment. Been bent out of shape for 20 years doing counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. Somewhat took the eye off the ball of armoured warfare. I was there at the time, and all the arguments were, that's all old hat. Surely Russia's not going to invade. Well, hey, look what happened. So there's some let out, but not much, to be perfectly honest. They really did take their eye off the ball in terms of upgrading the heavy armoured fleet of the Warrior infantry vehicle and the Challenger tank. So we're now left with some fairly tired equipment, to be perfectly honest. And like I say, of the 227 Challenger 2, 148 are going to be earmarked for upgrades to Challenger 3. But even though that is a new gun and some other whizzy gizmos, you're still going to end up, by the time of its out of service life in the back end of the 2030s, hulls that are about 60 years old. I mean, this is not where you want to be as a mainstream, as a European player, big name in NATO. So there's now the suggestion that this is the moment. If this armoured force of AS-90 and Challenger and Warrior and all the other bits and pieces, if that was designed to kill Russian armour on the battlefield in Europe, well, we've got a battlefield in Europe and there's Russian armour there that needs killing. So there's a suggestion that send the lot, just gift the lot. Russia is wiped out as a ground force, realistically, for 5 to 10 years. So take a risk, Britain. Send your stuff now. Use this moment. Okay, there's some contractual obligations. 1.3 billion has been assigned to upgrade for Challenger 3. But, cleverer people than me, when it comes to accounting, can get out of that or use that money for other things. Or, hey, it's 1.3 billion quid. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, that's worth writing off. The suggestion is get rid of the lot now. Give it to Ukraine and take this as a pause. So either invest in, Leopard 2 or the South Korean K9 tank that Poland just bought 980 of. The first 80 are going to be there in the next couple of months, and the rest of the 900 in 3 years. I mean, just timescales that we in Britain and elsewhere around Europe, but especially in Britain, we just don't do it. We don't seem to do that. We hang on to this defence sovereignty argument, more of which Ed Stringer is going to talk about tomorrow. But there is a moment here, a possible moment. Take a bit of risk because it will take time for Britain to get back in the armoured game. But maybe now's the best time to take that risk and at the same time using that fleet for what it was designed to do, which was to kill Russian armour on the battlefield. But plenty more throughout the week.
Yes, absolutely. And just staying on this one more moment, if I may, Dom, I'm very conscious there may be some listeners who are tuning in, having heard the news over the weekend about the tanks and weren't privy to some of the conversations we've had prior to now. So just this fundamental question, because I know this has been a real subject of conversation, which is, when this war started, we saw the tanks being used by Russia in a very ineffective manner, and the drones, of course, destroying them left, right and centre. And many people then were declaring it the end of the tank. So what is different about these Challenger 2s that will make them more impervious to those kind of drone warfare? Why does this matter so much? Just for the benefit of those listeners who are joining us today.
Yeah, okay. Well, when it comes to military capability, it's always one step ahead, then the other side get a step, and then you get a step, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in fighter jets, you build a lovely, great fighter jet, then the enemy build a missile that can shoot your fighter jet down. So you then have to come up with either a new jet or new countermeasures to knock out that missile. And then they come up with another missile to knock out your countermeasures. That's how military capability works. So in the evolution of tanks, yes, I mean, no tank is ever invulnerable. No one's ever suggested that. And Challenger 2 is a big old lumbering beast, fully bombed up with all the ammunition on board and all the stores and equipment. You're talking the best part of 62 tons. So it's a big old beast, which is kind of the ballpark figure for that size of tank. Tanks, there's the Holy Trinity of firepower, mobility, and protection. That's what a tank is. It's the best and most efficient use of those three: firepower, mobility, and protection. Now, if you cover your entire vehicle with armour, it will never move. You might have the biggest gun available, covered in armor, but that's a pillbox, right? You can't move it. You just won't get around the battlefield. You'll get bogged in. You just simply cannot move. So you've got to limit where the armor is. So if you imagine standing on top of a tank with a barrel pointing forwards, that's generally the side that faces the enemy, because you'll drive towards the enemy as part of an all-arms action, so with infantry next to you and artillery and air and helicopters and all the rest of it. So you're basically the front bit, that's the bit you're going to point towards the enemy. So if you was to stand on the top of a tank and hold your arms out sort of at a 60-degree angle in front of you, that's where the armour is. So it's in the front of the turret, and the front of the hull, and the first sort of third or maybe even a half of the side of the hull. So the rear of a tank is very vulnerable. The back, the belly, and the top is extremely vulnerable. You can bolt on armour. We see these big boxes. They look sort of shoebox-sized things we see on Russian tanks. They're explosive reactive armour. They're basically two plates of metal with an explosive element in between them. So when a round hits them, the explosive goes off inside the ERA box and it physically tries to push away the incoming round. And it can be successful, which is why modern anti-tank weapons like the NLAW and the Javelin are a dual warhead. Sorry, the Javelin is dual warhead, the NLAW is not. The NLAW has a top attack, goes over the tank and fires straight down through the soft top. But the Javelin has a tandem warhead. So the first warhead sets off the ERA, the second warhead goes through the tank. And this is what I mean about this constant sort of cat and mouse, one step ahead of the other. Challenger 2 doesn't go for that, doesn't go for ERA, but it just has very, very, very capable armour. Graded secret, so I mean I've played with it, I've kicked it, I've stubbed my toe on it, but I've no idea what the hell was in it. But it was just supposedly the best armour, pick your date, but the best armour in the world at that time. But like I say, you can't put it everywhere. But generally, if you work in concert with other arms and you use the tank to its full effect. So ideally, I mean, the tank round is designed to go ideally sort of 2 kilometres, 1,500-ish for HESH, which is the high explosive, and about 2,000 for the fin, the armour piercing, fin stabilised discarding sabot, the dart, the really heavy metal dart that just perforates enemy tanks and destroys them that way. So you want to be standing off at about that kind of distance. And with the optics on these things, so you'll have very good magnification by day. You'll be able to see thermally at night. So you can see further. You can engage the enemy from further back, so they can't see. And if they can see, they can't hit you. And if they hit you, then your armour is good enough to put up with that kind of strike. And if you're working, like I say, with all arms, so that you're not the only thing on the battlefield that the enemy is trying to shoot at, or that you're able to fire back at the enemy, then they are very, very capable vehicles indeed. Much better than the T-72, which is the predominant vehicle that Russia has on the battlefield. And as I say, it's the most efficient use of that triangle of firepower, mobility, and protection, but has its vulnerabilities. The roof is thin. A couple of inches of steel on the roof, so modern, what are MOD calling them now, non-returnable or one-way drones. Other people call them kamikaze drones that have a TV camera on them, so the operator can guide them onto specific natures of equipment, can fly them literally into the tank you want to kill. And if you come down from above, then yes, they can get through the top. But what do you need against these things? Well, heavy machine gun or other type of anti-drone technology to interfere with the radio signal that's controlling the drone, or some kind of what do they call it? The active protection measures. So a bit like ERA, but senses an incoming round or an incoming missile, incoming drone, and fires at it. A box that fires a small missile at the thing, almost like micro air defence, I suppose you could call it, at the thing coming in. So, of course, tanks are vulnerable to drones from above. They're vulnerable to in-placed munitions, as in anti-tank mines from below, because the belly of a tank is very thin as well. They're completely vulnerable. But it's always an evolution in these things. And in terms of tanks, there's just finally two ways of thinking about how they could be knocked out. There's what's called an M kill and a K kill. An M kill is a mobility kill. So some of these, if you start flinging high explosive around at a tank, you can knock the tracks off, you can damage the engine, you can destroy the gearbox, etc., etc., and then the thing's not going to move. Now the gun might still work, so it can still be capable. Obviously, can't continue the forward advance in an attack, but it's still very capable where it is, and the crew will hopefully be will survive and be able to get out and fix the tank or climb in another one and carry on. So there's an M kill. A K kill is when it's completely destroyed or written off, basically. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the crew are dead. And training these crews, whilst it's not absolute rocket science. Sorry, Hamish, but it does take a while to get to train the individual crew members, and then to have them working as a team, and to have that team working with other tanks, and then to have all those tanks working with all the other bits of the military orchestra. That's where it can take the time. So yes, tanks are vulnerable, but drones are just as vulnerable, and every other munition on the battlefield is vulnerable if you know how to defeat them, and you've got enough means of finding them and warning that they're out there. Then you can do something about it. And basically, the battlefield is it's not a health and safety place to be, really, is it? There's always something that can knock you out. So no, it's not the day of the tanks is not over. And final piece of evidence, if you want any more convincing, Ukraine has, since the Second World War, basically, Ukraine is up against the biggest armoured battle, as I say, since we've seen for about 80 years, and right at the top of their wish list for help from external donors are tanks. Right, so you say that the day of the tank is over. That's one of the things that Ukraine is asking for as a priority. So that would suggest that they still see utility in these things. Always going to be vulnerable, but use them properly, train them well, and they are still extremely capable. I use the expression, not mine, not going to claim it as mine, but I can't remember where it came from. But the old adage was that tanks are like dinner jackets. You don't need a dinner jacket every day, but when you do need one, only a dinner jacket will do. And it's the same thing for tanks.
Thanks, Dom. And just to add to that, I think part of the reason that the Ukrainians are so keen to have them is because of their intentions for Crimea and for other counter-offensives. And of course, you need tanks in order to be able to move troops forward effectively, to shield the soldiers, for more firepower, to punch through the kind of defences that we know around Kherson. So I think, as you say rightly, that it's all very easy for people to speculate. So, well, the era of the tank is over. But just ask those people on the ground what they need. And as you say, at the very top of their priorities are tanks. I think also as well, it's just worth underlining as well that for many people, things have reached a certain stalemate. One can question that interpretation, but for some they have. And whilst the tanks aren't going to be the game changer that some people might like, they are still nonetheless part of the solution that could be what breaks Russia's sort of defences in certain areas. They are part of a game-changing strategy rather than a silver bullet, as it were. So they're not the whole solution, but they're part of one. And so I think rather than this being seen as perhaps a turning point, it's the first step in what could be one. And that, of course, would play into what you were saying earlier on about the conversations that are happening amongst many foreign governments at the moment about what comes next after this and what further support they will give, not only just in terms of tanks, but other weapons as well, that this is all part of an ongoing conversation. Just before we turn away from weaponry, Dom, there was one other story about a Poseidon super torpedo that Russia have been bragging about today. I just wonder if we could touch on that very briefly before I come back to James on a story.
Yeah, I mean, I would touch on it briefly, only because I don't think it deserves a huge amount of airtime. Russia is very good at producing either a new piece of military capability, a new bit of kit, or testing something and saying, this is a new weapon that's going to defeat the West. I mean, we saw it with the Satan nuclear missile. We've seen it with the hypersonic missile. We've seen any new test, and Russia goes, there you go, NATO. There's one in the eye for you. So, yeah, Poseidon, it's a new missile. I've not heard of it before. Fine, great. I mean, look at the T-14 Armata tank. I mean, we mentioned these things years ago. I wrote about them years ago. This amazing new tank that's going to, as they say, have NATO, shaking in its shoes. Well, they've not turned up. I mean, firstly, they produced about 30 to 50 of them, enough for a sort of battalion worth. But they've only ever been seen on the armoured games and in test tracks and what have you. So yes, Russia announces all these things, but it's just bringing new capability into service. We do it as well. Now, our Ministry of Defence here is forever sending out beautifully crafted press releases about some new shiny little bit of kit that they want some airtime over. I mean, if we brought you every single bit of news about every single bit of new piece of military equipment being brought into service, we'd never move. But okay, fine. So Russia's bringing out a new capability. I don't think we should get too worried about it. Actions speak a lot louder than words, and we've seen what kind of Russian military outfit has turned up in Ukraine. And I think we should concentrate on that. I don't mean to be glib here, because what's happened in Ukraine is the Russian ground force, the land army, has basically been broken by this. But Russia still has a reasonably capable navy, more quantity than quality, but has a very capable submarine force, missile and air and space forces. Somewhere in the middle. So the Russian armed forces writ large, still capable. Although, like I say, the land army has been broken here. So I don't mean to say that there is no threat here and there's no risk, because we've seen what these people's tolerance for risk is, their risk appetite. But I don't think we need to worry. We don't need to quake in our boots, as they would wish it, for each new announcement that the Russian Ministry of Defence puts out.
Thanks, Dom. And James, just returning to you, you've spoken a little bit about Wagner earlier on, and I noted that you did a story for us over the weekend about a Wagner mercenary who dodged rifle fire and tracker dogs in an escape into Norway. Just wondering if you could fill us in a little bit more on that story, and also just your general reflections on how many Russian soldiers seem to be fleeing their armed forces or mercenary forces. I've not heard of many, but perhaps you can correct me on that.
Yeah, that story came to me quite late last night. Sort of a remarkable. This is a claimed escape. So this chap called Dmitri Medev, a former commander, unit commander in Wagner mercenary group around Bakhmut, claimed that he escaped over this very heavily fortified Norway-Russia border, which runs for about 123 miles in the Arctic, frozen wasteland, etc. And he claims that at 2 a.m. on Friday morning, he clambered over 2 barbed wire fences, legged it across a frozen river, was spotted. The searchlights came on from watchtowers, Russian searchlights. There was a couple of rifle rounds were fired at him, and a dog was set on him. And he miraculously escaped all this and made it to a Norwegian house, banged on the door and got help, and is now in Oslo seeking asylum. Yeah, it's a remarkable story. If we give him the benefit of the doubt, then this kind of proves my point that I was trying to make earlier, that Wagner troops are ready to be the Russian military shock troop, take over that mantle from paratroopers, because that is an incredible feat. Either way, this is important because he's the first Wagner commander to have fled to the West, and he says he's prepared to spill the beans on just how brutal the Wagner mercenary group is. So that remains to be seen exactly what he's going to tell us, how the Norwegians are going to deal with this chat, etc., etc. He himself is a petty criminal, and although Wagner recruited heavily from prisons, penal colonies in Siberia, he actually signed up when he was outside prison. So he signed up on the no duress. He signed up for a 4-month contract in July. And then he went down and was given a command unit to deal with in Bakhmut. At the end of his 4 months, he claims he tried to leave and he was told he had to stay on, but he'd become quite matey with his other fighters, etc., and they helped him escape. And then in December, he popped up somewhere in Russia, hiding Russia, and started to tell people about the terrible way that the Wagner fighters are treated, etc., etc. And then apparently he made this escape because he felt a threat. Wagner has this special group, Miod, which means honey, Russian word for honey, which go after people who desert the forces. And if they catch these people, they're killed. So this guy made this apparently dramatic escape into Norway. So Wagner do have a problem with their sort of fighters fleeing or deserting. And that's one of the reasons why Prigozhin himself said a couple of months ago, I think it was, that if he catches any deserters, they die. The deal is very simple. This is the convicts, the recruit from the penal colonies. If you serve a 6-month tour of duty in Ukraine, you get a pardon and you're free to resume your life. No matter if you're a murderer or whatever. But if you desert and you're captured, you die. Now, one of Dmitri Medvedev's fighters. He's the Wagner mercenary commander who claims he escaped over the border of Norway on Friday. One of his fighters was this guy who did desert. He was recruited from prison and he did desert to the Ukrainian side when he got to Ukraine. Fortunately for him, he was handed back in a prisoner exchange by the Ukrainian forces back to Wagner, and they dealt with him. They recorded themselves killing him. So this sort of meant that this guy, all Wagner fighters know this is for real. Even so, people are prepared to take the risk. I wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about an armed group of 6 fighters from a Wagner group who escaped from a camp in occupied Donetsk region, armed, and they were on the run around Rostov, which is a big city in southern Russia near the border. So, this is continuing to happen despite Wagner's threats to kill people they desert. The Russian armed forces, be it the regular forces or these Wagner mercenary groups, which are Kremlin extensions, sort of Kremlin militia, have a huge problem with morale and people deserting, etc. I had this terrible story at the weekend where a sergeant, I think it was, at a barracks in Belgorod in southern Russia, let off a hand grenade, which ignited ammunition in neighbouring houses, and killed 3 other soldiers and injured 16 others. These are all mobilised men. So if you have, the Russian media played this down and said the grenade went off accidentally. Russian opposition groups said it was deliberately set off by the sergeant. If you go with the Russian opposition media, which I'm more inclined to believe, then morale is so poor that even Russia's professional soldiers, sergeants who are meant to be there to keep the whole thing together. We know the NCO Corps in cadre in the Russian army is quite weak, but even so, these are professional soldiers. They're completely exhausted and their morale is shot to pieces, and they're essentially committing suicide and taking people down with them. It's a terrible state of affairs for the Russian army.
Thanks, James. Just before we end, I think it's important just to whiz through some of the diplomatic updates. There have been a few over the weekend and today. The first one that struck me is the story of the ex-president of Russia, our old friend Dimitri Medev, has said the Japanese prime minister should, I can't quite believe I'm saying this, ritually disembowel himself after urging Moscow not to use its nuclear weapons. So it's the latest in what is obviously a long line of shocking and provocative statements from this figure, who once upon a time was considered a West-leaning reformer, but has completely reinvented himself since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, and we can speculate as to all the reasons why that may be. But he was responding to a meeting between the Japanese Prime Minister and Joe Biden over the weekend, where the two leaders issued a joint statement saying, and I quote, "We state unequivocally that any use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine would be an act of hostility against humanity and unjustifiable in any way." And as I say, in response, Mr. Medvedev said in a statement that it showed paranoia towards Russia, quite how it can be paranoid when Russia openly boasts about using these weapons, but anyway, and betrayed the memory of, and this is very interesting, betrayed the memory of hundreds of thousands of Japanese who were burned in the nuclear fire of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, a reference to the use of the atomic bombs by the US to end the Second World War. And I mentioned that last point, not to be crass in quoting it, but to rather underline how so much of Russia seems to view America and the world, which is in this prism of the Second World War. And Natalia has spoken very eloquently on the podcast, as has Jade McGlynn last week, about just how important the Second World War is in the current Russian understanding of itself. And just the fact that it's referencing that as a reason why Japan and the US, which have been very, very close now for the best part of 80 years after the end of the Second World War, is just incredibly revealing as to, I think, how stuck they are in a certain moment in time, and how that then is used for them to reflect how they view the present. So that was one story. Just one other, which I thought was also very interesting, which is Germany's defense minister has resigned amid all of the Ukraine criticism that we've spoken about on the podcast in the last few weeks. So this is Christine Lambrecht. She's resigned following this criticism, as I say, of her handling of the military modernization programs and the country's arms delivery to Ukraine. She's put out a statement today that she submitted her resignation resignation request to Chancellor Olaf Scholz, saying that months of media focus on her has stood in the way of a factual debate about the military and Germany's security policy. The valuable work of the soldiers and many people in my department must stand in the foreground, she said. And just to list what some of those PR disasters and blunders were, listeners will recall that at New Year, I think this may well have been the straw that broke the camel's back. There was that rather awkward video that she posted on New Year's Eve where she was standing talking about how she found the year, and she was standing in a German city whilst there were all fireworks going off and explosives, etc. And it just optically looked insensitive. There's also the criticisms that have been made on her of the 5,000 helmets at the very beginning of the war, which has been very widely condemned since then. And clearly she feels that the media speculation and criticism is now having a destabilising impact on how perhaps Germany is viewed abroad and internally as well. So she's decided to fall on her sword. And who knows, perhaps it's part of an attempt to reshuffle the cards, as it were, prior to some announcements about Leopards. I don't know that, but I'm just speculating. It would make sense that if you're going to do that, you want it to be a fresh face that might be the person to announce it. So, as I say, watch this space this week. Dom, I know you had one more update on your conversation following with the senior Western official. Just wondered if you could fill us in on that before we turn to our final thoughts.
Yeah, so break. This wasn't a Western official. I was speaking to the head of a European foreign intelligence agency, so separate from. And I want to make that distinction clear because when journalists here are invited, journalists everywhere are invited into briefs with Western officials, we do not say where the individual comes from, any nation or organisation. And so I just want to make absolutely clear that the words when I say Western official in future, you don't immediately think, he's speaking to the head of whatever. I'm not going to name any agencies, but I just want to make absolutely clear that that the person I mentioned earlier on who said that this week could be characterised as the week the West enabled Ukraine to win, separate from the individual I'm just about to talk about now, who was, as I say, the head of a I'm not going to say which intelligence agency, but a European agency. And I don't want to pour cold water on the potential optimism from the back of what you were saying there, Francis. But we owe it to we're not going to make stuff up here. We're not cheerleaders for Kyiv. We just don't want Russia to win. So on the back of that, so the person I was speaking to was saying that they would not agree. The question was put to them. They would not agree that Russia has been militarily defeated. And in terms of sustainment, the individual was saying that at the current rate of ammunition usage, this was artillery in particular, the first half of 2023 is no problem, quote unquote, is no problem. Russia's now firing about 10,000 rounds a day, which is down from a peak in the summer of about 60,000. But Russia would be able to produce about 3.5 million ammunition artillery rounds per year if they put their current production means on double shifts, which they could easily do. They just tell people to come and do double shifts, or they get convicts in, as we've seen in some areas. So could easily transition to producing 3.5 million rounds a year, which is the current rate of use. Having said that, in terms of numbers, 14% of tanks have been lost. They've still got thousands of T-62. Again, clues in the title, 62. That's the vintage when it was first designed. Been upgraded since then, but this is very old pieces of equipment. But thousands and thousands, about 9,500. There we go. I'll put a figure on it. 9,500 T-62 left, which could be cannibalised to produce hundreds, probably not thousands, but could produce hundreds of workable tanks, workable for the fight that they are prepared to throw them into, which, as we've seen, is pretty much here's a metal tank, drive that way, fellas. So nothing like what we think Ukraine are using, and nothing like the Western MBT's main battle tanks that hopefully will be supplied. But what we're saying is that they've got reserves of tanks there. They've lost about 10% of their helicopter / fast jet fleet in this war since February the 24th. So a sizable number, but it still leaves 90% elsewhere. So the numbers are big, but they come from a big pool. And the individual was saying that it might take Russia 5 years to return to February 24th levels, but levels of military equipment, but they are still a very credible threat. In terms of ammunition, one of the reasons that it's very difficult, the individual was saying it's so difficult to get an idea of how long they can sustain, is because Russian forces take huge risks with their ammunition storage and handling, risks that we just simply would not take in the West. So we see a big pile of ammunition. We would not touch it. Russians are using it. Some of it's going bang because it's old and rusty and degraded and the chemicals have corroded and so on and so forth. They're handling it poorly, but they take much greater risk, and hence it's difficult to come to an agreement about exactly what stocks they've got. Mobilisation. So the second round of mobilisation, or the second half of the mobilisation that we've already seen, which we think could produce about 150,000 mobilised personnel. Russia's not closed the borders. Remember those pictures a few months ago of people trying to flee across the borders to get out of Russia before they were called up? Well, that's not happening now. And what that means is that those that want to leave can. Russia is I wouldn't say quite happy. I think they make life quite difficult for them, but they want those people to go. So those that are left are those that either support the war, are neutral, or just have no other option. So they're desperate, and therefore, as we know from the Russian military society, they'll just sort of go with the flow and do what they're told. So this second round, or the second half of this round of mobilisation, seems to be done in a more systematic approach to the first wave. The first wave, if you remember, was there to prevent the collapse of the front line. The second wave seems to be more about enabling Russia to go on the offensive. There seems to be a more systematic approach to this second wave. And the individual I spoke to just made the point that all Russian soldiers die as heroes, but they're largely forgotten about by the system when they're alive. And I think we've kind of seen that. So we should take it. It's a very credible source, but this idea that there could be thousands more mobilised people, Russian soldiers coming, and a more systematic approach to putting them together as formed teams and formed units, that is credible. In terms of society, this individual assessed that there was an anxious mood but no willingness to accept defeat, and said there's no revolution coming from the Russian people anytime soon. However, Putin does understand that Russian society will not forgive a loser. In terms of the Gerasimov move, so the head of the Russian armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, he's now head of the Russian armed forces and he's in day-to-day charge of the war. As we thought it was, this individual saying that was down to a power struggle in the Kremlin. This is seen as a blow for Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, who is seen as not delivering enough, partly probably why he's been so quick and so keen to tout Solidar as a massive victory, even though it's a small victory, probably, but they're not in complete control of the town, we don't think. The individual said it's a very Russian style for the top man to be sent in to fix things when they're going wrong. But Gerasimov, who, quote, tends not to be a military genius, just take that stiletto out your ribs, tends not to be a military genius. This could be the last chance for him. But Putin has put him in there, this individual was suggesting, because he values loyalty much more than capability, much more than actually being able to do your job. Loyalty is everything. I might mention that here at the Telegraph. He or she said that Russia sees the West's lack of consensus over what a Ukrainian victory would look like as a weakness, and has perceived there are cracks in the US Republican Party over support for Ukraine, and will try and fill that with influence, and we can expect more to come there. And finally, if there is any relatively good news from this, it was a very candid chat, and I think we're better for it. And I think we do need to express this as well as lauding all the failures of Russia. But finally, in the GRU, so the Russian military intelligence outfit that we know are in Ukraine and across Eastern Europe, well, of course, the whole of Europe, but a big effort in Eastern Europe looking for these ammunition supply lines around the airfield in Poland and elsewhere, where a lot of the Western kit is going in, and they are trying to identify these routes and then hand them over to their buddies, GRU buddies inside Ukraine, to identify the ammunition storage facilities and the logistic hubs for subsequent destruction. And we've seen that occasionally, haven't we? We've seen missiles, long-range missiles, going in and trying to destroy these hubs. But this individual confirmed that the GRU is trying to do that, monitor and identify these arms shipments, but says that Russia's targeting cycle does not allow them to be swift enough to hit moving targets or in any way interdict them, and agreed that they are more likely looking for the distribution sites in Ukraine. The individual thought it was surprising that there'd been no Russian strategic sabotage operation in Poland or elsewhere to either blow up some of these sites or to stop the or to stop the supply of arms, and put that down to a successful Allied counterintelligence operation. So there seems to be, the great game right now in Eastern Europe. You've got Russian spies running around looking for the HIMARS and looking for all the other kit and equipment being flown into Poland and elsewhere, of course, not just Poland, and then taken by road and rail across the border into Ukraine. You've got a big Russian effort there. Russian spies running around trying to interdict those sites, interdict those movements, hand them over to their muckers inside Ukraine. And there seems to be a very large Allied counterintelligence operation. So our spies looking for their spies and military people and God knows who else. That's my interpretation, not this individual's, I should say, of our people looking for them. So, I mean, the diplomatic front on this will, if it ever comes out, will be fascinating to follow. And with that, the individual disappeared back into the shadows. But I will pass on again from the next brief I have with such people, such that I'm able.
It's all starting to sound a little bit too much like a John le Carré novel. James, it's our time for final thoughts. If I could start with you, what would you leave our listeners with today?
Well, firstly, I don't think there has actually been a second mobilization in Russia yet, so we've had a lot of noise from Ukraine about this. But it hasn't been called. Obviously, that's something to watch out for. There are a couple of other tools that Putin and the Kremlin has, which they can use before they mobilize once again. One of those is only about half the 320,000 mobilized men have even been in combat yet. So he's got to reserve about 150,000 soldiers, etc. And plus, he's got a same number roughly of conscripts. So he may, it's a would be a highly politicized move in Russia to use conscripts. But he could, if you take the Moscow perspective that the annexed regions are now formed part of Russia, conscripts, if war hasn't been declared, are legally allowed to be deployed inside Russia. So legally, the Kremlin could do that. And they could also extend the conscript term, the period that conscription soldiers have to serve from 12 months, 18 or 24 months, which is going back to the Soviet period. So there are those are definitely things to watch out for our readers. I'd say with General Gerasimov and this terrible missile attacks at the weekend, I think he's maybe backed into a corner, and he has to, in a way, he has to deliver something. Surovikin wasn't really able to. He was able to shore up the sinking ship, and so I think with Gerasimov in charge, you will see an escalation of the war, such as we saw over the weekend. We might be seeing more of that sort of thing. We might be seeing more aggressive Russian military maneuvers on the ground, etc. I think he's been brought in. He's got a much higher political and public profile than Surovikin ever had, and I think he's been brought in to use that. And I think we will see that happening on the battlefields around Ukraine. And then finally, I think the story in Samara with the destruction of this battalion of mobilized men. We think up to 400 were killed on New Year's Eve at a New Year's Eve party in a barracks at a town called Makiva outside Russian Ministry of Defense, of course, lying and saying it's about 89. But it's clearly about 400, like the whole lot. So this is almost an entire battalion of mobilized men were destroyed in a HIMARS or Ukrainian HIMARS attack on New Year's Eve, and the repercussions of that are filtering through into Samara. I've seen some incredible videos where women who Russian Ministry of Defense is denying them information. It's just not helping, and it's really frustrating that these poor women whose husbands and sons were mobilised in September, October, and now have gone off to war and haven't heard from them. And I've seen some incredible videos of women saying, no, this is your war, not our war, etc. They're not directly criticising Putin or even the Kremlin, and a lot of the blame is at the Ministry of Defense. But that frustration, that sort of contractual deal that Putin always had with the Russian population, that he was in charge, they didn't have to worry about it, his authoritarian methods, etc., traditionally Russian, and he's going to oppose them, but he's going to take care of everyone. That contractual obligation to deliver Russians a safe and relatively prosperous life has been fractured. So if there's another disaster like this, or if the Kremlin propaganda machine starts to fracture even further, you might see more discontent. I'm not talking about revolution or massive protest, but just that sort of important sort of lack of confidence seeping through in the Russian and Kremlin system.
Well, thank you, James. And to end today, over to Tinker Tailor Soldier Dom.
Thank you for that, Francis. So this week, if it is indeed going to be characterised as the week that the West enabled Ukraine to win, then we've started off in a good way with the Chalitu announcement. I'd be very interested to see if Germany makes a move with the removal of the defence minister, as Francis was saying earlier on. Next move on this is, I'm told now, just after 4 o'clock, we're expecting Ben Wallace to speak in the House of Commons here in London. As I say, I don't think he'll give anything more. I think he's just going to give some more details about the announcement that came out over the weekend, but there might be. However, it does augur well for a busy week of gifting, capped off, as I said, on Friday. Location yet to be decided, or to tell Dom, but I hope to be there. The Ramstein contact group, so named because it first of all started in the US Air Base in Ramstein, Germany. This is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's initiative. About 50 nations now around the table gifting military aid, and only military aid, so not humanitarian aid, not just straightforward economic loans, etc. Military hardware for Ukraine. So Friday is that big event, and hopefully there'll be some other announcements in between now and then, starting off in a couple of hours.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 3 months access to our website for just £1 at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments on our new email address, which is ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message and now plan to reply to even more of them. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.